Please join us in a warm welcome for University of Maine President Paul Ferguson, retired U.S. Marine Corps General James Jones, and former Secretary of Defense William Cohen. Please rise and remain standing as midshipmen and cadets from UMaine Navy and Army ROTC present the colors, followed by our national anthem.
Please be seated. Good morning. Welcome to the University of Maine. We are extremely delighted to host you today for the 8th lecture in the University of Maine's William S. Cohen Lecture Series. We greatly appreciate Secretary Cohen, a favorite son of Bangor, and a great friend of the University of Maine. This lecture series has brought significant distinction to this university since 1998. Today's featured guest, retired U.S. Marine General Jim Jones, continues the remarkable tradition of distinguished individuals to visit the University of Maine as Cohen lecturers. The series started with a presentation by Secretary Cohen himself, and subsequent speakers included Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, John Glenn, Brian Mulroney, Dan Rather, Bob Woodward, and current Attorney General Eric Holder. As evident from this series, we have been fortunate to host the most influential individuals in recent political and international policy history. The Cohen Lecture Series is unparalleled in Maine and is certainly fitting that it occurs at the University of Maine. Serving the public is part of our land-grant flagship mission, and this series allows us to connect with our public constituencies in valuable ways. Equally important are students, many of whom are here today, benefit significantly from the opportunity to hear from Secretary Cohen and the Cohen lecturers he has shared with our campus. On a personal note, one of the major and extraordinary aspects that attracted me and my family to the University of Maine and the state of Maine was the unparalleled legacy of leadership characteristic of Maine, and so evident in Secretary Cohen. Mr. Secretary, I recall watching your nomination and confirmation to be Secretary of Defense under President Clinton. I was from away at the time, but I got here as fast as I could. President Clinton indicated that you were the right person for the right time. Mainers have a tradition of being the right people at the right time. Secretary Cohen's presence here today and his ongoing support of this lecture series and the university signals his deep, abiding commitment to his hometown and his home state. We do owe him a great debt, and would you just join me in giving him a round of applause in gratitude? Secretary Cohen will provide the formal introduction of General Jones in just a moment, whose distinguished military and public service career is matched by very few who have served our country. It is an honor to have you here today, General Jones. Welcome. And now just a brief word about today's format, which will represent a slight departure from past Cohen lectures. Secretary Cohen will offer introductory comments in just this moment, to be followed by General Jones' presentation. After that, we will move forward into a moderated discussion, a conversation, if you will, hosted by Mark Woodward, another great friend of UMaine, who is probably best known for his service as Bangor Daily News executive editor. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct and great pleasure to welcome one of the most distinguished and accomplished leaders in our state's history, former Secretary of Defense, William Cohen.
President Ferguson, thank you very much, and welcome to Maine. And I know that you're going to enjoy your first winter here, coming from Southern California. There are many in the audience today who are active members and veterans of our armed services, and I understand that we have representatives of all branches of the military here today, and I want to personally thank you for your great sacrifice and your service to our country. This is going to be dangerous because I'm going to acknowledge a few people who are in the audience today, and once I get started, it's like the word banana. I know how to spell it, but I just don't know how to stop. And here I want to acknowledge the Adjutant General of the State of Maine, Bill Libby, retired General, and my dear friend Ralph Leonard, and I saw Anita here as well, retired General Earl Adams, members of the University's Maine NRRTC and also the ROTC, members of the Bangor and Old Town Junior ROTC. We have members of Maine's troop greeters who are here today, and let me say to Leon and Audrey Higgins, thank you for leading this group of Bangorians who do really tremendous inspirational things for our troops who are returning home. You are the faces they see when they first walk through that airport and say, welcome home, young men and women, thank you for serving our country. So thanks to the greeters who are here today as well. We have a special young person, Petty Officer Monica Gogola, the Coast Guard, the Northern New England Enlisted Person of the Year, and Petty Officer Gogola re-enlisted last week, I believe, for another 3 years of service to her country, and I want to thank you personally for joining up and doing it one more time for our country. Thank you very much. There are some... There are so many people I need to also say hello and thank you to. My nephew, Mark Beckwith, is here. And Mark, it's great to see you. I don't get a chance very often, but I'm glad I'm able to say hello to you and to your mom as well. Judge Gene Carter and his wife Judy are here, and Gene and I go back a very long ways. David Carlisle and Susan, and I'll say a word in a moment about David's dad. I see Jackie McDermott, I see Mike Noyes, Joe Taylor. There are just so many out there. I can't see any of you now up here on the stage, but thank all of you for being such great friends of mine over the years and supporters of what I've been I tried to do as your representative. The Woodcock family I see is here as well in numbers, and thank you for your great service to our country as well. Let me stop here and thank one other person, Jan Staples. Jan is indispensable to the center. This meeting would not happen without her. The ones that have happened in the past would not happen without her. So Jan, wherever you are, thank you for all of the indefatigable work that you do on behalf of the Cohen Center for International Affairs. One final word, and that is of the passing of George Carlisle. He was a great friend of the University of Maine. He passed away last week. He was 98 years young. He never forgot this alma mater of his. He contributed both his time, his talent, his resources to this university. As I mentioned, his son David has been a longtime friend of mine. We go back to high school and college days, and he's here tonight with Susan and David. I just want you to know how much this university, this state, and this country is going to miss your dad. But he's had a great life, he's got a great legacy, and you're carrying it on, so thank you very much. I have a new book out. I'm not really here to promote it, but there is a quote that I introduced the book to the audience with. I want to read it to you. Historians report that in 1914, with most of the world already plunged in war, Prince Bülow, the former German chancellor, said to the then Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg, "How did it all happen?" And Bethmann Hollweg replied, if one only knew. If this planet is ever ravaged by nuclear war, if the survivors of war, of that devastation, can then endure the fire, the poison, the chaos, and catastrophe, I do not want one of those survivors to ask another, how did it all happen? And to receive the incredible reply, if one only knew. That statement was made by President John Kennedy at the University of Maine, October 19, 1963. I chose to use that quote, number one, for its poignancy and profundity, but also because it was issued right here at the University of Maine, forewarning what could happen in the event that there were any kind of a nuclear exchange between the United States and then the former Soviet Union. I mention it today because we have somebody who can answer the question, what if we knew? We have an individual that has been my great privilege and pleasure to know for, I guess, he's best known and best respected, one of the best respected in the country at the highest levels of both military and civilian government. And I am especially pleased to have him here today because he's been my friend for more than 30 years. And he's here especially because just as David Carlisle lost his dad this past week, Jim Jones' mother passed away 2 days ago. And yet he kept his commitment, Marine that he is to the Corps, kept his commitment to come here and be with us and to continue the Cohen Series lecture. I first met General Jones back in 1979 when I was elected to the Senate. I'd just been appointed to the Armed Services Committee, the Senate Armed Services Committee. General Jones at that time was a major in the Marine Corps, and he was the liaison to the Senate. And he worked in a very small office in the Senate with a talkative, high-energy colleague who was about a foot shorter and who I got to know very well as well, Navy Captain John McCain. And the two of them, you know, it was Sundance Kid time with both Major Jones and then Captain John McCain. And John was the Navy liaison in the Senate before his own career began for elective office. But even back then, I can tell you, it was clear that Jim Jones was going to be a leader both in the Marine Corps and the country. And he rose very rapidly through the military ranks as the years went on. And when I was Secretary of Defense, I needed to appoint a senior military assistant. And that billet really was for a one-star. At that point, Jim Jones was a 3-star. And I said, I need you. I need you to help me run the Defense Department. And he decided that it might not be a total impediment to his career climb. And he decided to take the position, and it helped me survive the battles at the Pentagon and beyond. And he worked with me day in and day out. We traveled the world together. And then from that point, he went on to become the Commandant of the Marine Corps. And then he was appointed to be Supreme Allied Commander of our forces in Europe before his retirement back in 2006. That retirement didn't last very long. President Bush reached out to him to serve as special envoy to the Middle East. And then, as we all know, President Obama interrupted his retirement again in late 2008 when he named Jim as his national security advisor. And I think there are very few people that you could point to who, at those levels, who have served both the military and civilian service. And their names are pretty well known in the history books. There are great patriots such as George Marshall, Brent Scowcroft, Colin Powell. And I would submit to you that Jim Jones will receive the same favorable treatment and judgment in history, and we should be grateful to him for his selfless service to our country. And you might guess by his height. He played some basketball in his days at Georgetown. He tells me he's available for a draft. If the Black Bears are looking to add to their roster this year, I understand they may have a position open. And I'll tell you this, we used to play a lot of basketball over at the Pentagon gym. And he claims that he always let me win just by virtue of my rank, and he really believes in protocol. But now that the protocol is over, he's never going to fess up that I really did win those games, and it wasn't. But he's going to make a few remarks, and then both of us will take some questions. He's going to then get on a plane and leave for Abu Dhabi this afternoon because he is in such demand, talking about issues of security, to be sure, but also about energy security, something that he has become a considerable expert in. And so we're going to try to be efficient with our time today, and I want to thank the university, again, Jan, the director of the center, for the hard work and is responsible for today's event. And one more thank you, Ralph Lancaster. I can't see you, but thank you for coming from Portland to be here. You've been a great supporter of mine and somebody the country turns to for great legal advice, so appreciate your being here. And now, General Jones.
Mrs. Secretary, thank you very much. And Mr. President, thank you very much for inviting me. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. I wish I could see you, but I hope that 30 minutes from now you'll still be awake, but if not, I'll do my best to keep you awake. On the basketball comment, I would just simply say that I was playing left-handed. I would be remiss if I didn't thank Secretary Cohen for not only his and his wife Janet for their lifelong friendship towards my family, but there's no question that I wouldn't have had the opportunities that I had if it hadn't been for Bill Cohen. I consider my 4 or 5 years in the Senate as the most transformational period in my life, where I realized that there was something outside the Marine Corps besides the Commandant, never thinking that I would become a Commandant. But thanks to Secretary Cohen, who nominated me, and thanks to President Clinton for not looking too deeply into my record, it all happened. Ladies and gentlemen, I am very, very pleased to be here to talk about one of the contemporary issues of our time, and I we'll look forward to the conversation that will follow afterwards. You know, we had a wonderful meeting with some students earlier, and one of the things I started out by saying is that I don't believe this country is threatened by any kind of military conflict in terms of the classic battles of the 20th century. But I think the biggest threat that I think we're facing has to do with whether we can compete in this rapidly changing world of the 21st century, and if we change rapidly enough to do that. So I think competitiveness is one of the biggest challenges that we face in this world that we help create. And with that, of course, goes the economic issues, and I know you all are following that. Last week I was out in California, and I heard an interesting statement from a cousin of mine who was in California, and she said, the economy is so bad in California that even the earthquakes are moving east. And now we watch, of course, with great anticipation, the work of the Super Committee. I don't know if you saw this in the newspapers the other day, but one of the members of the Super Committee was working late and was walking home to his apartment on Capitol Hill, and somebody came up behind him, put a gun in his back, and said, "Give me your money." And this member had had a long day and turned on his assailant and said, "You can't just walk up to me and put a gun in my back and say, ask me for my money. I am an elected official. I worked on the Super Committee. I'm trying to solve our nation's economic problems. You just can't do that." And the bandit said, "Okay, give me my money." So, ladies and gentlemen, on the program it says Arab Spring is what we're going to talk about, and we are going to talk about that. But before we do, I want to just, especially for the young people here, who are the future, I almost feel like apologizing for the world we're handing you. It's one that has materialized very quickly. We went from the end of the 20th century and the collapse of the Soviet Union to a position of unbelievable preeminence in the world. Even the French called us a hyperpower and foresaw that there would be no peer rival to the United States in the foreseeable future. This was just maybe 15, 20 years ago. And we came into the 21st century and we found, you know what? It isn't about a unipolar world, it's about a multipolar world. And we are in a world that we created in the 20th century. You, the members of the greatest generation, whom I never fail to recognize, and I am the proud son of two parents and my entire family who participated in that generation. And I think it is, Tom Brokaw really was correct when he said this is the greatest generation. The 21st century, though, is going to call for a new greatest generation. And members of that generation are the young people sitting here. I think there's a lot of hope and optimism for how it's all going to work out, but it's not going to be easy. And the first thing you have to do, I think, whether you're running a business or a country or a Marine Corps or anything that has people involved, is you have to understand the environment that you're in and what you're trying to do. And you have to have a vision for the future, and it has to be fairly strategic. Without that vision, without that idea, you can't motivate people to follow you and to get to the destination that you want to get them to. And so strategic thinking is extremely important. Sun Tzu once said, strategy without tactics is a slow road to victory, but tactics without strategy is a noise before defeat. And that's absolutely correct. And in order to succeed, we as a nation, we have to understand that the world is different. A lot of people are talking about it. Tom Friedman's book, I think, is one that I would recommend to you to read because it captures just how different the world is. And the thing that's ironic is it's a world that we helped create, largely. It's a world in which institutions that worked well in the 20th century find themselves somewhat paralyzed in the 21st century. It's a world in which decision-making at the national level in the more ordered, structured, symmetric 20th century is not working particularly well because even the very definition of what constitutes national security has changed. I had the opportunity to participate for the last 2 years in redesigning the National Security Council to reflect 21st century national security interests. Things that were never in the National Security Council, like cybersecurity, global development, energy, commerce, trade, economic issues, and the traditional 20th century issues that deal with organized countries, but also non-state actors, fairly new. We combined Homeland Security and national security into one National Security Council with one national security staff to deal with the world as it is, not as it was. And it became a real satisfying moment to see how we could change rather quickly this very small organization called the National Security Council to deal with the 21st century. 21st century is a world that we should do very well in. It requires people who can make rapid decisions. It requires people who can process information and intelligence very quickly. It requires people who understand that the whole of government is going to have to be involved in this. Not just the Defense Department, not just the armed services, but a little bit of the National Security Council and the State Department, and everybody else is on the outside looking in. Secretary Cohen touched on it. Energy security is absolutely important to our future. And energy security is a national security issue, and energy access is very important. There's a lot of good news there. But for us to be a country of great influence in the 21st century, we will have to have a national energy strategy in order to be able to lead as we should and as the world expects us to in the 21st century. So the phenomenon of the Arab Spring is really interesting. When I accepted the president's offer to serve for a couple of years to try to get him started, I had a very frank conversation with him. I asked him a question that went something like this. I said, Mr. President, if somehow you were empowered to do one thing, and one thing only, on solving the various problems that you're faced around the world, what would that be? What do you think the most important one is? And he replied, the Middle East. And I said, I think that's absolutely correct. I think that at the epicenter of most of the world's major difficulties, whether you're talking about Iraq or Afghanistan or Pakistan or problems in Africa, all the way to West Africa, the epicenter of the challenge that we face is still in the Middle East. And if you look at the world as a series of concentric circles, if you could lay the world out flat, and you could pinpoint what is the one thing that you could do that would have a ripple effect that would spread very rapidly all over the world, I still believe in that the Middle East represents that part of the world. And it's interesting that we haven't been more successful over the years with regard to finding a solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Because, and the reason it's interesting is because everybody knows what it's going to look like. Even the participants themselves do, the two sides. For the last several years, there's been a consistency of view in the Arab world, in the European world, and in our world that with 95% degree accuracy, people know what the solution is going to look like. And yet we can't seem to find a way to get the process started. And so with that as the epicenter, and I'll come back to it in a moment, with that as the epicenter, you go around these rings that gradually go outside. You think of all of the things that have been happening in the world in the 21st century that might have affected and created this explosion called the Arab Spring. And I would suggest that the only thing that was surprising was when it happened. The United States has for many years talked to leaders in the Arab world, particularly President Mubarak, about the need to reform his society from within, about the need to become more democratic, about the need to pay more attention to human rights, and about the need to do something to affect the economic condition of his country. When you're in power for so long, it obviously, and you survive many attempts to remove you one way or the other from office, you tend to become fairly complacent and you don't listen too well. And as a result, the changes that we had been, all of us had been suggesting would be helpful and to the people of Egypt, for example, did not take place. And over the years, a generation of young people, people who had traveled abroad, people who had access to the internet, people who were involved in social networks, started connecting up these dots in this new era of rapid transmission of information. And the spark was ignited in Tunisia. And the rest is now not history because it's still too recent, but the rest is still evolutionary, and we'll have to see where it stops. But I am absolutely sure that the message was transmitted far beyond North Africa to rulers all over the world who might take a look at what the people in the street are saying and what they're asking for. And what they're asking for is the things that we have been preaching and advocating as the optimum way that people can live on this planet in peace and harmony during the 20th century. So how it happened and when it happened is an interesting subject, but the fact that it happened really should not be too much of a surprise. And so the meaning of it is very simple. That the meaning of it is that people in that part of the world and others are now understand that there are other ways to live. They've been there, they've seen it, they've studied it, they have access to the internet, and they understand more and they know more about what's going on in real time all over the world. And that has dramatically changed the world that we live in. The have-nots of the world are saying to the haves of the world, we need help, we don't want to live like this, and we don't want to be ruled as we don't want to be oppressed anymore. We want our children to have the same opportunities that other countries in the more developed part of the world have. So when you look at the 21st century and you look at the Arab Spring and its phenomenon, you know, the fact that it happened so rapidly and the fact that it is still going on is very, very interesting in terms of the overall outcome of this transformational period. I think the phenomenon of the Arab Spring is probably the most important event that's happened on the planet since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And it has profound consequences for the future. One of the things that I think is absolutely imperative that we do is understand that these expressions, the desire for freedom, the desire for greater economic opportunity, the desire for more transparency, more say in how they're being governed, is not going to go away. But the challenge for us is to make sure that the outcome of these expressions in Tunisia, in Libya, in Egypt, maybe Yemen, and who knows, maybe in Syria, and who knows where else, but that the outcome of those expressions actually materialize into a better way of life for those people. If you recall 30 years ago when the Shah of Iran fell, that was a transparent revolution. That was a desire for more freedom, more opportunity, less oppression, and the revolution was hijacked by the Ayatollah. And we now have the giant shadow of Iran over everything that happens in the Middle East, to include the Arab Spring. Iran is the ever-present, ever-growing danger to not only the region that we're talking about, but to the world's security and safety because of its nuclear arms program. So the question for students, I think, is what is it that we do about this? How do we reorganize ourselves, and how do we influence this new phenomenon in the 21st century? One, to make sure that these revolutions do come out right, that they are more democratic, and they do achieve the freedom and the economic opportunity that they want. And it seems to me that we need a new paradigm in terms of engagement that suggests that the old school of just sending in the armed forces isn't quite good enough anymore. It isn't enough. To be sure, in my view, there are three elements that we have to pay attention to when we decide to intervene to help a country achieve its desired status as a freer country, as one with more economic opportunity. The difference is that all three of these pillars can be applied in different ways, and would have to be. But the three pillars for engagement in the 21st century, in my view, are security. That starts there. The second one is economic development, and the third is governance and rule of law. And there's a lot of subsets to that, including corruption, but government and rule of law, economic development to show people that there's a brighter future for them by following the path towards more democracy. And then the security aspect has to be dealt with simply because it's a fact that without that one, you probably can't have the other two. And so if you apply those metrics to the countries that you're trying to help and influence, and you realize that unilateral projects like this are probably fairly expensive, then you can say, okay, the 21st century is basically going to be about coalitions. And you can turn to an organization like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is in the middle of a major transformation with regard to its strategic concept for how it's going to be used. You remember in the 20th century, NATO was a defensive, reactive, static alliance with never had any goals of inflicting the first shots on the Soviet Union. We committed ourselves to a principle of overwhelming retaliation, and the Cold War ended without really a shot being fired. 21st century, though, an organization like NATO and some of our other international institutions cannot afford to be simply passive and reactive. We cannot afford to sit and wait for bad things to happen and then react to them. The world is moving at a much more rapid pace that demands not preemption, but proactive engagement. And that proactive engagement, in order to make sure that the phenomenon of the Arab Spring comes out the way it should, will include the private sector, the public sector. It will include the American business community. It will include the non-governmental organizations. I used an example this morning that I thought that it would have been a good idea immediately after the violence stopped in Libya to put a hospital ship, perhaps the USS Hope, for example, as we did in Haiti, off the coast of Libya, to start rendering medical aid to those who were wounded in the fighting in Libya. This has a much more powerful message to the people in the streets of Libya to see an American ship and hundreds of patients going out there and receiving the quality of medical care that they could not possibly get in Libya in the aftermath of their struggle. So the coalition approach, a belief that security, economic development, and government and rule of law is important, is really I think the cachet for American engagement in the 21st century. We can't be everywhere, and we're going to have to pick and choose. But if you study the world and you look at the various regions, you kind of know pretty much where you have to be. and where the outcomes of these struggles has to come out the right way. It simply is too important, and the risk is too high. And you can be sure that very quietly under the facade of all of these movements, there is an element, probably sponsored by Iran, that is working equally hard to make sure that the next Egypt is not democratic, the next Libya is not democratic, the next Tunisia is not. And we have to be realistic and understand that we can't afford to be surprised. Okay, we were surprised in Tunisia, fine. And then Egypt happened, and now we look at Syria. And Syria to me represents a real opportunity. I've spent a lot of time talking to leaders from the region, and they passionately believe that Bashar Assad will not survive over a long period, and that Syria itself will change. The question is, how will it change? And we should be working very hard to make sure that if and when that day comes, that we have the proper, not only national response, but international response in order to make sure that the next Syria is representative of what the people of Syria want, which is freedom, economic development, and better governance. It's very important that Syria work out the way we need it to work out, because it will affect dramatically Iran. Iran, a failed Syria and a rebuilding Syria is not means that an organization like Hezbollah could be mortally wounded. It means that a country like Lebanon could free itself of the shackles of Syrian dominance and Iranian dominance. It also means that the prospects for an Israeli-Palestinian settlement could be enhanced. So the dominoes that fall with the two big ones, Egypt and Syria, are profoundly important, and we should understand that the strategic consequences that are at risk here, because they're extraordinarily high. So how we adjust and how we adjust our institutions and adjust our thinking and create more of a whole of government approach to dealing with the world is extremely important. I'd like to say one word about Libya, because I think it's important. I think that the outcome in Libya in terms of our participation was exactly right. I don't think we led from behind. I think that's not correct. I think that this was a moment in time where the North Atlantic Treaty Organization made a decision in 9 days to act. Some members of the organization decided not to, like Germany, but they went on with it anyway. The strategic leadership was provided by an American admiral, the operational leadership by another American admiral, and we had the two JTF commanders. One was Canadian for the land forces, and the naval forces were commanded by an Italian. And you know what? It worked. The 75% of all of the effort was provided by the Europeans. A key 25% was provided by the United States. It wouldn't have been successful without us. We did the heavy lifting and things that only we could do. But it was a good moment for the alliance, because it showed, I think, our European friends that when we say that the alliance has to be resourced in order to be effective, we're not joking. And that because of our own economic problems, the likelihood that they're going to have to step up to it until we get our act together is probably pretty high. But this was a good moment for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it is emblematic, I think, and reflective of this proactive engagement that needs to happen in these emerging countries that are seeking greater freedoms, a greater economic opportunity, and a better way of life. And I think an organization like NATO could have a major role to play in any Mideast settlement between Israel and Palestine, and it could be very positive. And the question is always, with regard to that issue, is who's going to take the first step, and how do we get people back to the table to reach such an accord. But to the young people here, to the next greatest generation, you're living in a world that is vastly different. We've got a lot of lessons to learn from the 20th century. We have a lot of people to thank for that great gift to the world and rebuilding the world in a different way. We now are facing a world in which competitive challenges from Brazil and India and China and Japan and the European Union are things that essentially we supported and created and advocated. And now we must understand and try to do a better job at understanding how we need to change in order to succeed. I can tell you this in closing, that in all of my travels over the last 20 years, the world does not want to see the United States become a lesser player. The world does not want to see a dominant China and a lesser dominant United States in the 21st century. And for us, ladies and gentlemen, it's not a question of either or. It's not a question of, can we withdraw from this world? We can't. We can't withdraw from it. It is too small now, and we're too tied together. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But I think that our next greatest generation, many of whom are sitting here, will take us to that place where the United States, by the year 2050, will be that bright shining light on the hill that people want to emulate because of the example that we set, the character of our people, and the values that we profess to live by, and that really the underdeveloped part of the world is saying, we want that too. And it's a great opportunity, I think, for this nation to lead and to think strategically, do the things that must be done, set the example. And I'm quite confident that by the year 2050, this nation will still be the nation of great influence, importance, and emblematic of the way most people want to live their lives on this planet. I thank you very much for having me, President, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's been a pleasure to talk to you this morning.
Thank you so much, General Jones, for your service and insights. Wonderful. Well, ladies and gentlemen, as I mentioned earlier, Mark Woodward will now moderate a conversation with Secretary Cohen and General Jones. In addition to his long and meritorious service with the Bangor Daily News, Mark is known to all in our community for exemplary public and community service. He demonstrates that once again today by joining us to participate in the program and lead our conversation. Please welcome Mark Woodward.
Well, in the interest of time, we won't be taking any questions from the audience, but we do want to see if we can provoke a conversation here. We did have some very thoughtful questions provided by Professor Paul Holman and the students who participate in the Transitions in the Middle East class, which is a companion to the Cohen Lecture Series. To take us back to your epicenter, General, and to Syria, and also your mention of NATO and Libya. This morning reports that among other factions trying to oust the Assad regime, the Muslim Brotherhood is asking for the Turks to come in, the Turkish help, which is interesting. They don't want Westerners, but they want Turkey, which of course is a member of NATO. Under what circumstances should the United States consider another Libyan-style intervention, specifically in Syria? And you touched a little bit on what we hope for as an aftermath, but what would the U.S. role be following what we hope is a successful overthrow of that regime?
Well, I think a lot of dominoes would have to be set up. A lot of structures would have to be set up. I certainly don't think it would be a unilateral effort. This would have to, if it happened, it would have to be generated from the UN through the North Atlantic Treaty Organization again. And then we would have our own debate as to, what it was that we would do. But I think the main thing to remember here is that we are in a world where unilateralism is probably not the best way to go. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. I'm struck by the belief by some of the rulers of countries, the leaders of countries in that part of the world, just how convinced they are that the people of Syria will succeed in forcing Assad to leave office. And that's, if that's true, then what we really have to be ready is for the next morning after that.
If asked, would you recommend that we engage there in a NATO-style operation similar to the support we gave Libya?
I think it's, not trying to avoid the question, but I think it's it's really a pivotal country in terms of what it means to Iran to lose a vassal state like Syria, what it means to Lebanon in terms of its potential to move towards a freer state. And as we go down this trail, right now I think that the correct analysis is to watch and see what's going to happen within Syria itself, whether we get into another engagement or not. I think there's still some time to decide that. But I want to go back to what's most important is what you do when it happens. And it would be a lot better if it happened internally, I think, rather than have another NATO and a kind of Western European intervention.
Secretary Cohen?
Could I just add to that? I think the most important thing is that for the Arab countries to lend their support for this effort, so it doesn't appear that the United States is trying to engage in a military operation to support this movement. Once the United States were to be seen as doing that, that tends to undercut the credibility of the people who are putting their lives on the line by revolting and rebelling against a dictatorial policy. So to the extent that you see the Arab League say to Syria, you're out of the league, maybe they'll let you back in, but not yet. To the extent that you see a country like Turkey, which I think is going to contest Iran for power in the entire region. Turkey itself is changing. Turkey is no longer going to be a secular country. I think it's going to be much more of a religious-oriented country. But nonetheless, they're looking to Turkey as being the role model where you can have a democracy with democratic values and still be a religious state. We'll see how that works out, but it's no longer going to be a secular state as we once knew it. But being a member of NATO, nonetheless, it is very powerful in terms of its growing power in the region. And so if you have Turkey, if you had countries like UAE, which supported the operation in Libya, if you have the Saudis who are supporting this, then it builds an international aspect that then allows the United Nations or NATO to come in. But I think if the United States gets in the forefront, other than with moral support for those who are demonstrating and revolting, I think it would be negative rather than positive.
The Arab League, by the way, was ahead of us in terms of their sanctions on Syria, in terms of pulling their ambassadors out and so on and so forth. And the Arab League, I think, deserves a lot of commendation for their actions with Libya as well. So they have not been invisible. They've been very active, and that's a good thing.
Secretary Cohen mentioned Saudi Arabia, and in your remarks you mentioned the importance of energy independence, and of course Saudi Arabia is central to the conundrum we have in the Middle East. How do you assess our relationship with Saudi Arabia currently, and will Saudi Arabia eventually be affected by these ripples from the epicenter, which right now is in Syria?
Well, I think first of all, in energy issues, I don't think advocating energy independence is not a good strategy, because it's fairly insulting to the rest of the world. It basically implies that if we've got enough, we don't have to worry about you. And so I advocate a goal of energy sufficiency in this country, which I think we can achieve very quickly. And I won't go off into it now, but what we need is a national energy strategy and some major reorganization in our government on how we deal with energy issues. The best we've ever had is a la carte energy policy in the United States. But with regard to Saudi Arabia, this is a very important ally for us, not just because of oil. It's just a very important ally. They are the big heavyweight in terms of influence in the Gulf, in the Arab world. And we've had a very good relationship with the Saudis, and we continue to. We've had some division of opinion in terms of the fate of President Mubarak. The King of Saudi Arabia was not particularly thrilled with how quickly we, their words, not mine, but threw him under the bus. And they were equally puzzled by the fact that we seemed to tolerate Assad longer than we tolerated Mubarak. And so those are inconsistencies that people, other leaders around the world watch us. They watch what the United States does, and they draw conclusions from that. Let me ask the Secretary to...
I would agree. What happened during the Arab Spring, so-called, is that a number of our allies in the region were very upset with us. Not that we could have changed anything on the ground in Egypt, by way of example, but the perception was you didn't waste too much time in disposing of someone who had been, quote, your friend for 30 years, and you might have provided a more graceful exit out of power, using your powers of persuasion. But they just saw it as, okay, 70 days of revolt, you threw him out, is that what you're going to do to us? So there was that element of discontent. Similarly, there was some notion that the administration started to get out front and say, well, now they're demonstrating in Bahrain. And we started to criticize very heavily the King of Bahrain, and the Saudis said, time out. That's real crucial to us. Iran is trying to foment discontent in Bahrain, and you can't cross that red line. They sent 3,000 troops into Bahrain. I don't think they were invited. They sent them in saying, this is a line you can't cross. And then I think the administration backed away a bit and said, okay, we want to counsel Bahrain to act with less force in trying to suppress the revolt, and that came about. So there was some real tension there for some time. But I just came back. I was in Saudi Arabia 2 weeks ago, and meeting the new Crown Prince and paying tribute to the passing of the Crown Prince that I had worked with. And you've got an aging leadership. Change is going to come to Saudi Arabia, probably last, because it's the host of the two most significant religious designations in all of Islam. And so the king is probably 90, maybe 91, I'm not sure. His brother just passed away, was late 89, 90. The new crown prince is, I think, 77, 78. So we're looking at an aging leadership. The king, actually being in his early 90s, is nonetheless a reformer. And he is doing what General Jones was talking about earlier, getting rid of the corruption. A lot of corruption, that people taking advantage of contracts and whatever. Now they're going back. He's got new people he's putting in positions of power to try to eliminate and reduce the level of corruption, because he wants to bring Saudi Arabia into the 21st century. By way of example, he allocated $400 billion just for infrastructure to be spent in a 4 or 5 day period, a 5-year period rather. 5 days, that would be very soon. But he wanted it during his lifetime. Yeah. And he's building mega universities, and they're building new rail systems, and they're starting to employ Saudis and focus on education and science and medicine. And that's what's taking place in the Middle East. If you go, Jim is going off to Abu Dhabi. Go to Abu Dhabi, you're going to see a city of the future. Go to any of these other countries who are focusing upon what? Math, science, education. They all are doing what General Jones is referring to Tom Friedman's book. It used to be us. It used to be us. We're the ones who had all of these values and virtues of self-discipline and fiscal responsibility and emphasis on education and family values as such. Well, that's what they're doing. Because as Jim said, they want what we have. And the goal for us is to make sure that, yes, they want what we have, and it's a big enough planet that all of us can have a much better life. But we've got to want it as bad. And if we don't, and we start see ourselves slipping into mediocrity, we've got a problem. And I think Tom Friedman's book focuses on that. And I'll give you one quick example. In the first few pages, he talks about a situation in Bethesda, Maryland, in which there is an escalator in the metro system. It's been out of commission for about 3 or 4 months, maybe longer now. And the projection was it would take 7 months to fix this one escalator in the metro stop in Bethesda. In an 18-month period, China went ahead and built the most magnificent railroad station complex that you'd ever want to visit in 18 months. So they're focused on a goal, and we're still taking 8 months to fix an escalator. So something is wrong. And what we've got to get back to is saying we've got to promote excellence, education, dedication, and discipline. Those are the things that made us strong, and if we don't do that, we're going to slide into a second-tier capability.
General, you mentioned in your joke about the super committee and what that presages in terms of defense cuts. Representative Ron Paul, who, as we know, is running for the Republican nomination for president, has suggested closing bases in Japan and Europe. I think reasonable people see a possibility for some sort of a reduction in the defense budget because we're drawing down in Afghanistan and Iraq. However, we have the president in Australia. We've got a nascent base opening outside of Darwin in Australia, and Secretary Clinton has reaffirmed our military commitment to the Philippines. This, of course, we assume having to do with China's rising power in the Pacific. What are the strategic implications of closing bases in Japan and Europe, bringing home the troops? It has some allure in terms of whatever might be safe financially, but
I think it's not a question of what you do, but how you do it. I used to have some strong discussions with Secretary Cohen's successor, Secretary Rumsfeld, about the value of forward presence. This is, to me, as I mentioned in my remarks, one of the legacies of the 20th century that you could lose, and if you lose it, you'll never get it back. And so you have to be careful. We have a phenomenal advantage by being able to be forward deployed. Not only does it keep the threats further from our shores, but it also allows us to engage and to work with other like-minded people to help their militaries develop, to help their subordination to civilian rule, and to lead by example, by presence. It's just unbelievable that, so many years after the end of World War II, in Germany, it's a real crisis when America threatens to pull its forces out. Eastern Europeans are still, basking in their newfound freedoms, but they always keep one eye over their shoulder towards Russia. And everywhere in the world where we've had forces, whether it's Korea or whether it's Japan, whether it's the Philippines, whether it's in our own hemisphere, we have been able to create, to maintain stability and to lead by example, and to have an unquestioned advantage over any other country in shaping the future. And so I strongly advocate two things. One is that we don't need the World War II footprint. We're not in a world war. Second, that I believe that expeditionary forces on a rotational basis could do the same thing with a lot fewer people. But to keep the access, we created a few years ago a unified command called AFRICOM. We've ignored Africa for as long as I can remember. Africa is one of the key competitive battlegrounds of the 21st century between us and China, and some other countries also, India perhaps, but certainly us and China. The African Command was created, but we were a little bit clumsy in what we called it. We called it a combatant command. And it's very difficult to go to a head of state in Africa and say, we would like to put a combatant command in your country. And calling it a combatant command is not what we should call it. It's a unified command, whatever you want. And it should represent kind of a whole of government approach. In other words, military, yes, but also diplomacy, economics, the issues of our time. And then you have a better chance, I think, of getting that kind of presence somewhere in Africa, which is a critical battle space. So I think that some reductions are in order, but I think that we ought to shape it in a way that we are present where we need to be. And my favorite expression about forward engagement is to always remember that virtual presence is actual absence. And you may think virtually, but if you're not there, you're not competing in the best way possible. And if you lose the access, you don't get it back.
I think we have time for a follow-up by you, Secretary.
Yeah, I think in terms of a novelette that was written many years ago, Jonathan Livingston Seagull, you recall this mystical seagull that Jonathan was trying to fly faster and faster, and he would keep zooming and going out of control. And finally, this mystical advisor said, Jonathan, you really don't understand. Perfect speed is not a matter of going faster and faster. Perfect speed is being there. Now, he was talking in terms of, a metaphysical presence. But that notion of being there is critical. And for those to argue that we have to pull back and disengage, you are going to forfeit the future of this country. If you look at what's taking place, China is building up. It's going to be a military power. It's an economic power. The military power to follow is inevitable. Okay, well, how do we deal with that? Isn't it ironic that Vietnam is asking us to help resolve the issue over sovereignty over the islands of contention right now? So Vietnam says, America, come to our assistance. The notion, most countries are fearful, looking at our internal debates, that we are going to disengage and pull back. And when we do that, we set in motion a dynamic that says they've got to make their other calculations. If the U.S. is not here, what do we do with a rising power? We have to make our own arrangements, and those will not be favorable to us. So we have to have a presence. General Jones is precisely right. It depends upon the size of that presence and how it's shaped and how you influence. If you're not present, you don't have any influence. And if you don't have any influence, the world is going to turn very much against your interests. So I think that we can make some changes. I would not want to see us pull back from South Korea right now. I would not want to see us pull out of Japan right now. I like the fact that we're building up, at least on a modest basis, our presence in Australia. And it sends a signal. We want to have better relations, stronger relations with Australia, with Japan, with South Korea, with India, and yes, with China. So that China, as it grows and expands its military power, understands there are a group of democracies and not trying to contain it, want to make sure that they're going to integrate that power into an international norm. And that can only be done if we're present.
Could I also say that I think the Defense Department can make a big contribution to our economic dilemma by instituting some much-needed reforms in how we buy things and how we spend our money. The days where you can wait 12 to 15 years to procure a major end item should end. That is outrageous. That it takes that long and it's that expensive. And so I think some basic reform in terms of acquisition and how the Defense Department spends the money can yield huge savings. But I wouldn't find the savings at the expense of our strategic deployments.
Well, gentlemen, thank you for being here. and it's been fascinating. On behalf of the audience, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much for a stimulating conversation and for truly challenging us to excellence in the 21st century. Appreciate it so very much. General, could I ask you to join me at the podium? I have a couple of gifts for appreciation of what you mean to us, for sharing your time and a very special time in your life today. The first gift, we're going to give you two. I hope that's all right.
That's fine.
Mr. Secretary, I know that you're going to be a little bit concerned about this first gift, but I love you very much, but don't take this out on me. This is an autograph from our women's basketball team. Coach Richard Barron wants to ensure that we thank and congratulate General Jones for his years of service to our country. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Now, it would probably be too much to ask for a little one-on-one before we go on, but thank you so much. And our last token of appreciation is a clock that we hope that you'll place on your desk, and when you remember us in the University of Maine, not only your time of service, but your time with us. Thank you, General.
Thank you very much.
This will be for the next Cohen lecture, a one-on-one right here. I think that'd be great. Ladies and gentlemen, we're so very grateful for you coming and being with us this morning. It's been a wonderful interaction when you think of the incredible years of service and commitment to country that you've seen today. We look forward to our next Cohen lecture, and that will be in 2 years. But thank you so much. We always love you coming back to the University of Maine. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, very much.